Hey, this is Sabrina Monarch of monarchastrology.com and Magic of the Spheres podcast. Welcome or welcome back to my video series about Pluto in aspect. I'm making my way through the solar system and shared with you about Sun Pluto and Moon Pluto, as well as a general introductory video about what Pluto in aspect means in a natal chart and in a person's life. So this is actually my second take or second attempt with Mercury-Pluto. And that sometimes talking about Mercury, it's a bit of a flurry and there's a lot of ideas, and that's what Mercury does. And in recording that and thinking about it after, it gave me some time to refine my thinking about it as well. So one thing that I want to share that came through in my reflections was just, let's look at the basics of Mercury affecting Pluto and Pluto affecting Mercury. Whenever you have two planets in aspect, they interpenetrate one another archetypally. And so Pluto is our archetype of the underworld, of depth psychology, of undercurrents, of the force of nature and its direction, right? And the way that nature has a teleology, like nature has an energy or a process that wants to unfold. And from our perspective in our personality or our ego, we can really wrestle with what's wanting to unfold at a soul level. Like we have these unconscious processes or these deeper underlying motivations or compulsions or addictions. And so Pluto is a journey of making that material conscious and also getting like on board or aligned with it. And so we wrestle and we grapple and we have like challenges or feel disempowered with Pluto when we're kind of at odds of the wave of nature that lives inside of us, or when we feel like we can't, we are overcome by it, that we can't, like we don't have willpower or capacity in the face of our addictions or compulsions and whatnot, versus when we are truly aligned and friends with that energy. It will take us on a ride. It will bring us into a space of evolution. Pluto is also about transcending our limitations. So one more thing I'll say about that with transcending our limitations is this feature of merging. Pluto is a lot about the deep bonds that we form, the entanglements that we have as well, and how divesting or investing our energy in frequencies and relationships and so on can thwart or help us in our path of evolution. And then we have Mercury, who is a planet that relates to intelligence, relates to cognition and mental processing. Mercury relates to the capacity to see things from many different angles. Mercury is quicksilver, relates to intelligence, if I didn't already say that. And so if we put Mercury and Pluto together, we have the intelligence and shiftiness and trickstery quality of Mercury influencing Pluto, which is interesting to think about in the sense that a lot of our unconscious patterns and defense mechanisms and shadow material and whatnot, it's smart, right? Like we understand it at some point, we see it, and then we're like, cool, I've overcome this pattern. And then it sneaks up on us at a new spiral of evolution. And we thought, I was over this, right? But our deep underlying unconscious patterns that drive us and drive our personality, they're smart, okay? So there's something about Mercury-Pluto where that type of intelligence can be disempowering in the sense that a person's psychological structures, there's that cleverness of Mercury to maintain whatever blockages or compulsions or addictions Pluto is running. Or you have like the quicksilver intelligence related to the evolutionary side of Pluto. So you can see like that quality of like breakthrough or mentally, cognitively getting to the bottom of something such that transformation occurs, right? And then if we have Pluto affecting Mercury, we have this like deep undercurrent affecting a person's mental, cognitive life. So these are kind of like investigative or deep thinkers or obsessive thinkers, transformative thinkers, powerful thinkers, right? And it goes beyond thinking with Mercury, but that's an entry point. So within all of that I just named, like holding the multiplicity of that is going to have us maybe go for a ride on this presentation, because with Mercury, it's like, this is a perspective, but also it could be this, and you kind of flip it around a little bit. And essentially that's what any astrological interpretation is about. It's multivalent. There's multiple ways it can express. But there was something about Mercury here in my first attempt to record this where I was like, this is broad. I need to feel deeper and root deeper into the archetype. So what I just shared with you as like an introductory starting point, that's what I'm inviting you to hold throughout this transmission, even as we go down the rabbit hole, as it were. So this video, is for you if you have Mercury and Pluto in aspect. It's also if you're seeking to understand this for your astrology studies and whatnot. So let's get started. This contact, so having a Mercury-Pluto aspect, brings potency, drive, and persistence to one's mental faculties. This can range from obsessive thinking, so perhaps in a way that feels disempowering, like having intrusive or anxious thoughts, or, thoughts from the underworld always coming up. But it also ranges from getting into contact with and sharing information that is evolutionary, right, at any level. So evolutionary in terms of driving the story or the momentum of one's life in a meaningful direction because of some cognitive breakthrough, right? And then I boiled it down as well to sharing information that helps further survival, to bring it like a layer deeper with Mercury-Pluto. And so the reason for that is that Pluto relates to the epic life or death struggle, right? It's not just life, it's not just death, it's the reckoning with being attached to existing, attached to our survival, and yet also the ultimate reality that we don't make it out alive, right? Like there is this quality with Pluto where it puts us in touch with that kind of like survival edge. And this could be in terms of like a species survival kind of thing, there being some kind of new challenge environmentally or new challenge socially, like new challenge in any way that requires some level of adaptation. It's simply adaptation to be able to move forward. And I think that Mercury really reflects this kind of adaptive quality, but then it's also about communication. And so this could be internal communication that we have, in our own internal life, but there is something collective about it, I think, as well. And Pluto is a transpersonal planet after all. And so there is a layer of Mercury-Pluto experience that can feel very personally psychological, but I want to expand it throughout this talk in terms of ways that our own personal problem solving often has like a collective component to it. So more on what I mean by this. As creatures, we encounter various problems that cause a good deal of distress or expenditure of energy as long as they're active problems, right? So in some sense, the evolutionary edge for Mercury is to figure something out. And once we've figured it out, it kind of can recede back into the unconscious, such as, when we're first learning how to read words as a child, it's a process, like we're really like, working it out in our brains. And then at some point, you look at a word, and if you've ever seen like how if you use the first and last letter of a word, but you scramble everything in the middle, the brain still recognizes the word pretty easily because there's a certain level of unconscious cognition that's going in to make something easier because it's already integrated. So some of the things that we kind of adapt and have in our system with Mercury-Pluto might be like basic and helpful. Other of them might be very complex mental cognitive programs about, our childhood conditioning and this series of factors means this, like, i.e. some kind of trauma. But let me not get ahead of myself and get back to this slide. So we're seeking answers or solutions, right? There's this problem-solving quality of Mercury. This might not be explicitly philosophical, the answers we seek, but just a matter of information, right? And so where I'm getting that is like Jupiter and Mercury dialectic. Like Jupiter is going to be a little bit more or a lot more philosophical. But Mercury is still like, it can be different kinds of intellectual problem solving, like, what vitamins or foods are going to help me be healthy and heal this particular ailment or be well, or what like communication skill sets can I introduce into my life to have better relationships. So it's like these tweaks or these adjustments really with Mercury. And to bring it back to survival, the Pluto part of it, while these examples of like, maybe health, finding the answer, the problem is a matter of survival. But these things are always like explicitly survival seeming. Sometimes it's convenience or inconvenience, and whatnot. But we organize our self-concept, we organize culture around certain intellectual concepts. And then these concepts may help us adapt or be maladaptive in nature. And the process of reaching these awarenesses and communicating them is one faculty and often higher potential of Mercury-Pluto, because you have a mind that's like a force of nature, like Mercury-Pluto. It's trying to figure something out. And there is the risk and the liability with that of getting kind of stuck into some psychological complex eddy loop side channel and run a program over and over again compulsively, right? Or to like really break through that and like transcend, get beyond, go deeper than those mental limitations, those conceptual limitations. And so that's where you get the libido of Mercury-Pluto wanting to figure these things out. So the Mercury-Pluto mind is driven toward finding this data that's going to support evolution or survival. At the bottom line, right? It might be more like, I want better communication skills, so that I can, I have like this public speaking that I have to do, and that is related to my finances and my job, which is kind of related to my survival, like if we boil it down. This Mercury-Pluto can also be consumed with organizing the data and expressing it and communicating it. So mental fixation and attachment. Because one's mental schema, Mercury, and the will to persist or be empowered, Pluto, are connected, the Mercury-Pluto person may feel deeply attached to their particular perspectives for certain moments in time. Right? Like Pluto is an interesting archetype in that it's a force that drives us to live and then to die, right? To be born into this ephemeral temporary existence where the end result is that we'll die, and then reincarnate and come back and, evolutionary astrology, come study it with me. But it's the same thing as like, the will and the energy that you have to like really invest in a passion, and then you go all the way with it and you kind of complete your karma with it. And then you're like, okay, like next thing. It's not always that like pretty bow wrapped on top. Sometimes it's more conflictual or whatnot, but essentially like Pluto is like, here, like move your life in this direction, and everything in this life is impermanent and it's going to end at some point. So when it comes to like mental concepts, the ideas that we have may be an ally for a particular trajectory that we're on. And then it has its own kind of life cycle, because a lot of mental concepts are, we think Mercury, it rules Gemini and Virgo, these mutable signs. So change, right? Like it might, for example, at a collective level, if we think about public education being connected to the age of, industrial age, and kind of like preparing children to be conformists and to be good factory workers and to memorize things and to be part of like a mechanistic worldview universe. That type of thinking, that conceptual model, did its job, its agenda, maybe of that creating that kind of factory consciousness. But then when we start to face deeper paradigmatic problems or breakdown of society or like systems kind of issues, that type of intelligence to train people to become factory workers, as an example, doesn't solve the problem anymore. So if we think about this at a psychological level, Mercury-Pluto can be like, what are your mental schemas, your mental paradigms that supported you or were adaptive for a particular moment of your evolution? And then you develop security and attachment to it because it got you through, it helped you survive, it helped you thrive even. And then reality changes, or like you're in a new level of initiation in this life, and those same concepts aren't going to help you anymore. And so the Mercury-Pluto inner turmoil and struggle at that point is, I'm going to hold on for dear life to these ideas and rationalize like any new information or data that I receive to fit what I already think I know. And then you have like, Mercury's fucking smart and Pluto's like, has that attachment or fixation potential. And so you can get a mind that is really kind of addicted to its own loops and its own patterns and doesn't want to change. And then in that space, one of the images I thought of, which is similar, like a Mercury-Mars person could do this as well, but in terms of like encountering a perspective from another person, as an example, that the Pluto aspect of a person finds threatening, being able to use their logic to kind of undercut the idea, tear it down, or undercut the person. Or, the person with Mercury-Pluto feels so deeply identified with their ideas. This is just a possibility. This is the contracted kind of like stuck or stagnant possibility. And the sense that the thing that's driving that is the mental patterns that have like developed this, like, this is how we survive. Like, this is the thing. But then we also have the possibility for transformations in thinking. Right? So again, there's some reasons that we're gripping onto these mental concepts. But when we get on board with these ideas need to die or recycle, or like, I need to think in a new way, or think in a way that's actually like more powerful, or like connects me to a deeper sense of agency, then you also have like a mind that's willing to really go to the bottom and go through and come out to something new, something on the other end. And then this isn't just going to be like a change of mind. It's a whole life change. So you can think about like, if you're a person who's worked on your mindset, for example, and you've actually tracked how your mindset influences your actions and the results that you create in your life and the paradigm that you're living out because of what you think and believe. And if you actually have like a deep root level shift of those mental precepts, often you behave differently, you notice different opportunities, you take a different avenue, so to say, and your life actually changes. There's a whole domino effect. And further, once a person has gone through this kind of mental transformation where they've made it through their own kind of mental stuck loop paradigm, and they're working at it, they get to the bottom of it and they find something more powerful, this individual can become deeply persuasive as well. Like Mercury-Pluto, I think, also has this thing to it of like going viral on the internet or something, like one's ideas, like getting this kind of like collective change kind of thing. Like that could be other like Mercury transpersonal pairings. But Pluto, I think, is that like, I want this idea to be infectious, or I want this idea to come across. And so there's many different ways we can think about persuasion at a personality level. And it's not just persuasion, but it could be things like a thought leader or someone like a therapist that asks you questions or sees, gives you perspectives that like actually are really helpful, transformative, etc. But I was also thinking about advertising and Mercury and the merchant connection, and how a lot of advertising is related to like, there's a manipulative like side to some forms of advertising that are really like so psychologically driven that they're meant to kind of like bring up your pain points, rattle you, and get you to buy like quickly and emotionally and whatnot. And that would be kind of like, a potential Mercury-Pluto thing. Also the kind of like logical structures that go really deep into like, here's a problem. I had this problem myself. I tried all these things. They didn't work. This is the journey I went through. Then I found this thing, like this mental breakthrough, this concept. And these are the results I had, and you can have it too. Right. And so that kind of thinking or that kind of communication is essentially like spreading adaptation. Like, here's a common like problem. I wrestled with it, and now here's the codes to get through. Mental alchemy. Having a natal Mercury-Pluto aspect can relate to having many advances in thinking. And it often serves one with this placement, and really anyone, to learn how to become increasingly aware of what they are actually thinking and where these thoughts are even coming from, right? So at a surface level, what we think, sometimes the Mercury-Pluto person, their surface thoughts have the underworld in it. But we tend to filter, like if someone's like, what are you thinking? Or, you're just having a conversation with someone. I am getting an image too of someone who's going through like a really rough time in life, and they're like on the edge, but then they go out and someone's like, how are you doing? And they're like, oh, it's a rough time, and they're like laughing, and it's like, whatever. And they're not going through and giving you the whole diary, like secret hidden transcript part of their experience. And similarly, in our own mental processes, there's a layer of thoughts that we're like having, that we're kind of aware of. And then there's also deeper implications of those thoughts. And so thoughts are not always like true, right? And like also they're not always helpful. They're not always aligned. And so let's say a person is wanting to, or is needing to, for whatever reason, become more relational, like better at interacting with people. And they're starting to notice that if they're tracking their thoughts, every time they're interacting with someone, they're like scanning the person and judging them and being like, I wish I wasn't even talking to them right now, or whatever. And it's like, interesting, like those thought patterns that you are like unconsciously having and haven't really done anything to shift or alchemize are creating this experience where you're kind of misanthropic, for example. And so when we take our thoughts for granted, we're that attached to them as like, yeah, I think it just is, whatever. That's different than being willing to like look at the thought, sit with the raw discomfort of the thing that we're thinking, and then actually reimagine or reinvent, is there a different way I could look at this situation? And therefore have a different result in my life, right? And with Mercury, there's so many perspectives. It's not always about like, this thing is ultimately true. Sometimes it's just a perspective, but it has a point or an edge to it. And so a person who's like really kind of doing this process of alchemizing their thoughts and coming up with thoughts that are, less draining, less disempowering, less counteractive to their, desire and like thriving. And they're actually like digesting and like recycling and alchemizing that material into thoughts that have power, then this person might be doing mental work or catalyzations for others, right? They could be thought leaders, or they could be, that person that always has like a really clever or helpful perspective when you talk to them about what you're going through. When you read a book that changes your life, it's that, like, this book is a compact consequence of someone's mental transformation. And so the phenomenon passes to the reader and the reader's transformation, or the idea, passes the transformation. And to go back, so there's the evolutionary potential, the like powerful alchemical thoughts, or getting stuck. So in the Mercury-Pluto person at various points in their process, they may have those like they're really on the wave of this kind of empowering thought or cognition, or they might not have that alchemy yet and feel really stuck. Mercury-Pluto can relate to stubborn mental or neurological patterns that act more as compulsions or addictions, right? Things that just want to be fed on their own. Like I remember having a powerful time, like working through my sugar addiction. I feel like I need to create something else about that because there's so much to it, but I had this moment of like going into Target or something. I had to buy batteries. And when I passed like the aisle of like all of this candy, I had this really weird sensation of like, I want all of it. Like it all looked appetizing to me, but I knew myself to not even like those kinds of candies or just like total pure sugar things. And I was like, what's going on in me? Like what part of me is so co-opted by this sugar addiction that I'm like, having like jackpot money eyes looking at this like gross, sorry, like to judge, but like this like extreme just junk food aisle. Like what's going on, And so I think there's something about like Mercury-Pluto where like in that moment, I could see that's not me. Like that's a thing that's running inside of me or like in my gut or whatever. And so similarly, this was one that came up in a conversation recently around like where a certain point, like resentment and stewing over like how we've been wronged or something is a way that the mind creates homeostasis of like maybe we're at a certain level of happiness or well-being. And then another part of our mind is like, but here's all the things we're resentful about and like tries to compete with that like happiness, right? And so if a person is seeking to create more like joy in their life or something, they're confronting their kind of like neurological or like nervous system habitual patterns around like, okay, if you want to expand and feel joy more often, where's the resistance? Where do you have like energetic tracks in your consciousness that are doing something else, right? So they're like programs that have a power or have a kind of tenacity to them. And if a Mercury-Pluto person isn't necessarily aware of those particular energetic tracks or isn't caring to change them, maybe they're getting something out of it, they might excessively rationalize their perspective to avoid a greater transformation. I want to think of an example. Okay, so let's say in terms of like interpersonal conflict, that a person has like a thought loop going and like their own rationalization about it's the other person's fault completely, right? And yet this is a situation maybe that happens with multiple people and they're the common denominator. And they always find ways to be like pointing fingers, well, it's that person's problem, it's that person's problem. And then the very thing inside of them that's also participating in, they're avoiding looking at it and using their mental faculties to come up with these projections of why it's always the other person's fault. So this type of excessive or compulsive rationalization can disempower them, such as spiral them into various neuroses or depressions based on their mind, as well as be a source of ways that they are limited in their capacity to see other perspectives. And then further, they may attempt to dominate others or dominate situations with their mental perceptions. This is, at an extreme. If an individual is drawn to get past the limitations of their own mind and to cease being disempowered by their own mind, they could be drawn to various practices that help them achieve transformation in their mind or nervous system, or they may be drawn to powerful ideas or ways of thinking that allow them to recycle ideas that aren't supportive or evolutionary, and that allow them to get in contact with ideas that are more liberating or evolutionary. And so what I mean by that is that these methods could be very cognitive, like writing down like a thought dump of what you're really thinking and like working through that material in a methodical way. It could be talking with some kind of like coach or something like that. It also could be doing something like breath work, where like at a physical nervous system level, you're creating different conditions, which may help kind of like burn off energy and create some change. So it could be, when I say practices, like Mercury is so, like a master of many trades maybe, or just like dabbler of trades. And there's like so many different ways that we can work with creating transformation in our nervous system. So another possibility with Mercury-Pluto is that this is a very like investigative mind, and it's one that wants to get to the bottom of things. It's like a mind that's sensitive to undercurrents and undertones. And so that could be very like powerful and very tapped in and very deep and provocative, or maybe taboo. Thinking about like different like sociologists or theorists who are writing about culture, but they're writing at it from like they're getting underneath something. So there's the possibility of this kind of brilliance here. And then there's also the possibility of like projections and distortions filling in the blank, right? Like there's this kind of suspicion or fear that then creates like a narrative that doesn't actually exist. And so anyone who has that kind of like scorpionic or plutonic or like detective kind of mind often goes through things around self-trust, right? Like actually being really honed in on their instinct. And there's a certain level of like mental purification or nervous system purification that can support that. Right. So like, I'm going to leave that example for later. But one thing, that I was writing here below too, is that like the mind is a strange creature. It's capable of all this invention and genius, and also hell and distortion. And a Mercury-Pluto person has significant mental libido, which confronts them with the challenges of the mind, as well as energizes a propensity for mental transformation or breakthrough. So a little thought on detoxing, in that with Pluto, there's often purification processes, and this isn't purification in like a Puritan way about being good or like a particular set of ethics. It's like clean. And Mercury is really skilled at making connections, and you can make, you could babble, like you could just say a random sentence and then say something else, and like there'd be no coherence to it, but you connect the dots in some kind of like, in some way, right? And so the mind tends to believe its stories. They're very compelling, especially with Mercury-Pluto. And so, this meme, I'm sure you've seen it, is like an example of like being fried on one's own concepts. And so just think about like the mind, picking up the data that it's digesting, right? Or picking up the data in its environment. And Mercury-Pluto relates to the possibility that there has been some excess. That there's been like a lot of raw material that needs to be transformed or released in some way. So one example I gave here was like the buzzed, intense ideas and perceptions of a person awake for 24 to 30 hours, caffeinated, after binge watching some videos about conspiracy theories, right? Like, what is the quality and clarity of that mind? That's a short-term example, but what about an accumulated excess of toxic or irrelevant sources of information or data through childhood or cultural conditioning, through societal messaging, through media, through ideas which have stuck onto them, right? Like a thing you heard once or someone said to you once that like you always held on to and like developed this complex around, or an onslaught of conditioning that shaped, your concepts and your perception when it was distorted to begin with. And something that I'll say about this is that things can be released, like just really let go of, or sometimes they need to be digested and alchemized, like in some kind of way where it's not just trash that we had like these experiences. Like we actually figure something out about it or create something with it that gives it a sense of meaningful transformation. So by that, I mean like a lot of healers, a lot of coaches, a lot of people that help, in the world have their own life material that was really unpleasant or challenging or traumatic when they went through it. But the way they like mentally, emotionally alchemized it, turned it into valuable ideas. So it's not always just about taking out the trash, like kicking it to the curb. Like sometimes there is like a deeper resourcefulness of working with that material and turning it into something helpful. And then another note on detoxing is that the releasing, as I was saying, might be mental, but it could also be general, tending to one's physical, emotional, or spiritual health, right? The mind can be very invested in its stories, but Mercury-Pluto is also about what's underneath. So there might be actual like energetic or nervous system patterns that are below the story and kind of energize different emanations of the same story, and that you can kind of play on the surface realm or get to the deeper energetic undercurrent. And that might be more of an embodied experience, for example. And when that deeper thing is addressed, the mind can also often soften. So a little Mercury-Pluto paradox here to bring it back to survival. And I was saying at the beginning that Mercury-Pluto can be about like having these deep transformations in thinking that then create an idea that can be transmitted to others who have similar problems. And, it helps not just the person move through something, but it also moves through the environment at an ecosystemic level. At the same time, the mind, or like our nervous system, has deep ancestral hardware around remembering information related to survival, which relates to our capacity to recognize threat based off data or information, right? Like we're intaking data and information all the time, and then we're interpreting it, and often at an unconscious or automatic level, right? Like not all of the data are we picking up are we doing it like some conscious register. There's a lot that happens underneath the surface. And a lot of that is very ancient hardware that relates to living in a reality in which there's environmental dangers and predators and whatnot. And we need to have a quick enough stress response or danger response to adapt to those threats. And then here we are, like in our very complex world, taking in a lot of information. And if a ton of the information that we're picking up is feeding our threat system and it's going on overdrive, having like our heart rate go up over things we see on social media and like the news, and this thing that this person said to me, and this like environmental factor that's happening all the time. And then the body and like the nervous system is just in that level of like arousal. That paradoxically challenges survival because stress creates dis-ease. So one of my kind of like loose thoughts or theories is that like part of the evolutionary process that's happening now for humans is like this kind of catching up with the amount of data and like information and speed of our lives, and actually like evolving our nervous systems to be able to either hold that data or to kind of be a filter that allows it to like pass through us, but not something that we like hold on to. And so within this, there are some toxins, right? Some mental toxins, like environmental toxins that we have power to not partake in. And then there's certain toxins that we don't necessarily have power to not partake in because they're cultural, or they're in the air, or they're in the water, or something like that. And this is a thought, like at a deeper level of magic. How do we relate to the toxins that we don't have the power to not be exposed to? Right? So like one example of a toxin could be like a person's deeply unkind, perhaps untrue, scathing critique of you. Maybe it's happened multiple times or something like that. And what do you do in the face of that information where, you know, you can't erase it from your ears? It's like entered you. Does it stay in you forever? Or is there a way that you're able to filter it out? Or when it comes to like, you know, some people might go the full mile and like do some kind of heavy metal detox, right? And like have like an actual system for detoxing some kind of environmental thing. And then it may also be like, you know, I remember I had a time, this awakening where I felt like every like food was full of poison. And at some level that's true, like processed food and whatnot, and like what's allowed to be in food and junk and all of that. And it was so upsetting to me. And some people go through that like phase with the toxicity of food where it's like they can't even, you know, they would have like a panic attack eating it. But then at some level they soften later on. And while they generally eat healthy, if someone's serving them a meal and they feel like, you know, I want to accept the meal that's being served to me, even though it isn't perfect, I'm able to eat it and let it pass through me and not like hold on to it with so much anxiety and fear and think about the hydrogenated oils or whatever the thing is, right? And so thinking about how I want you to really expand that metaphor for yourself and like where you see it in terms of toxins that we're not empowered to necessarily not be exposed to, and how we relate to that because of the adaptation, right? And is the adaptation something that you really do at a concrete level, like some kind of cleanse, or is it more mental or spiritual in terms of not buying into the excessive anxiety that this thing will be the end of you, for example, or creating some kind of like, and it's a complex one, but just thinking about where there's that mind-body connection and the way that our mental concepts and what we're focusing on can create ease and like adaptation in the body, or create panic and dis-ease. We don't need to be too like black and white about that type of thinking, but just something to like really reflect on more deeply. And then at a personal level, a Mercury-Pluto person is learning how to refine their deep perceptive tracking of their environment such that they are not themselves unduly harmed by it, and they can be increasingly clear as opposed to distorted in their data recognition and analysis. I remember reading a book one time that was it was like, like about someone having like a full-on mental breakdown. And it was like their kind of like trip of insanity. And I remember like walking around after reading it and everything looking so distorted and grotesque to me. And it was like directly because I had just read that book and was like in the conditioning field of it. And to me, I mean, that just came from a book, but we might have our own patterns where it's like there's something that triggers us mentally. And then because we're exposed to it all the time, like we have this challenge really because of that. And so thinking about how this Mercury-Pluto person is working with those particular mental hooks, like places of getting really kind of like blown out mentally or at a nervous system level, and like whatever empowers the person to create change, even if the environmental factor doesn't change. Right? Or they might be so powerful as a communicator and as a thought leader or something like that, that they create a certain level of change or change of thinking in their environment. That's possible too. And so beyond the most basic Plutonic urges of threat or survival, which is like the underlying like bottom line, this Mercury-Pluto dynamic shows up in a variety of more nuanced mental and intellectual processes, like a person writing a PhD, which, you know, depending on the topic, you could boil it down to an issue of survival. You can really look at things through that lens, but there can also just be like a kind of like going deep into any kind of thought or perspective or process, and like really, you know, going deep into a craft, going deep into a line of thinking. And everything that I've shared around like the kind of the drive to keep things the same and use rationalization or use the cleverness of Mercury to not evolve versus like the cleverness of Mercury to help the evolution move forward. That's what we're looking at in general with Mercury-Pluto. So I have no idea how long this was, but I'm happier with this one and I am going to publish it. And I forgot to say at the beginning to like this video and leave a comment. Super helpful when you do that. Let me know in the comments how you relate to this. If you have Mercury-Pluto, I would love to hear from you. And stay tuned to my channel, subscribe to my channel for more videos about Pluto and aspect. And I also share a lot of forecasts, and we'll be coming out with new things that I haven't even thought of yet as well. So thank you for being here, and I hope that you found this helpful or enjoyed it.